morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on Kishida's Great Gamble. I'm joined today by Dan Harada. Dan Harada and I are going to double team today to give you an explanation about what's going on in Japanese politics now, what it means, how we got where we got to today, and what is the prognosis for moving forward. So first of all, I think everybody has heard about the kickback scandal that has really just infested the LDP and news throughout Tokyo for the last 3 months. So the Diet went into session 1 week ago. The emperor came and opened the Diet last Friday. And the Diet has been in hearings all this week, mostly focused on what the LDP or what the prime minister intends to do with the kickback scandal. This all started several months ago, right around November, when a political scientist assigned to a university in Kobe came up with this theme, this theory about political kickbacks inside the LDP. And he wrote a paper about it, but he was so incensed about it that he actually filed a criminal complaint. A criminal complaint, once it's filed, needs to be acted upon. And the public prosecutor's office began an investigation, and things began to happen very rapidly. Akahata, the mainstream newspaper for the Japanese Communist Party, printed it out, and it began to take on a little bit of steam when the Diet was still in session. Then the extraordinary Diet session ended, and when the Diet is out of session, the public prosecutors can approach members of the parliament. And they did this in a very robust fashion. But even as the story began to break, they were investigating and interviewing people who were Diet secretaries or working in the various political factions. When this whole story started, there were 6 political factions that make up the LDP. And for most of the people who are on this briefing, I know you're Japan hands, you know what's going on in Japan, or you're at least keenly interested, you understand most of the background here. The LDP is difficult to conceive of without the participation of the factions. The factions emerged just as soon as the Liberal Party and the Democratic Party were joined post-war to combat socialism and communism in the early post-war Japan. So it's a part of the fabric of the political party, the LDP, which has held power basically since the end of World War II. In any event, this whole story focuses on political parties, political factions within the LDP holding these faction parties, these benkyokai, these study groups, collecting funds. I go to them all the time. Dan goes to them. Dan is actually a member of the LDP, so he's got great insight there. But the political factions would collect money, maybe in some countries in the United States, it's like a $500 a plate dinner. It's not $500 here. It's usually $100 or maybe $200. You get a briefing from somebody of great significance in politics for maybe 40 minutes, a little bit of Q&A, and you wrap it up. They're usually breakfasts, sometimes lunches and dinners. But what happened with the story was that the money that was being collected was being non-reported as income to the faction, and then it was being parceled out to some of the members of that faction and not reported to them. So the whole idea of collecting money and dispersing it, it's not illegal unless you don't report it. So this slush fund was created. And that is the whole kernel of what this kickback scandal is about. So as the news began to break, the public prosecutors moved in. They arrested and indicted many people who were counting the money for the political factions. They were investigating and arresting several Diet secretaries. 2 Diet members have been implicated there, indicted. One of them has resigned specifically as a result of this. And now we are in the Diet session again. So the public prosecutors can no longer go and attack members of the parliament. But in the meantime, the LDP has actually been forced to come to terms with this, probably by the public prosecutor's office, who said, look, if you don't clean up your shop independently, we're going to come in and clean it up for you. So with that, Mr. Kishida made a couple of decisions, and that is the title of this program, Kishida's Great Gamble. There were 6 factions just 2 months ago, 1 month ago, and over the last week, they have been disintegrated. Dan, this is a big gamble for the prime minister to unilaterally decide of the 6 factions. He is going to take it upon himself to dismiss his faction and dismiss 2 or 3 of the other factions that existed.
Yes, he made that decision all by himself, and as you said yourself, this is gamble, a big gamble. He has governed the country with the help of Aso Taro-san, who himself he heads one of the factions. And they together have made every single decision regarding the government, except for one. Kishida-san by himself, without having consulted Aso-san, decided to disband his faction. and Aso-san found out about it in the media. And they had a meeting. Kishida-san tried to convince him to dissolve his faction. Aso-san refused. Factions were supposed to have three basic goals. First one is to raise money. Second one, to support their members for cabinet posts or very high party posts. And the third one is to teach the new guys in the faction the ways of Nagatacho. So most of the factions have been disbanded, except for Aso-san. And Aso-san yesterday announced that the faction would stay on, would have its usual weekly meetings, would keep its office, and go on as if nothing had happened.
This is talking about all of the factions. You've got Seiwakai, Shikokai, Heisei Kenkyukai, Koichikai, Shisuikai, and Kinmiraikai. These were before Mr. Kishida actually made this gamble of his to close down independently his faction. His faction has been his faction has elected 5 prime ministers, and he took it upon himself to dissolve his political faction. And I guess he already knew that the Abe faction would have to collapse on its own, which it did yesterday, right? So when we started this whole thing, the dissolved factions included Mr. Kishida, whoever was in charge of the Abe faction, Mr. Nikai, and Mr. Moriyama, who was not implicated in this scandal. When the professor made this investigation and reported to the public prosecutors, the Moriyama faction was not implicated in these cash giveaways and collection and slush funds. In any event, Mr. Moriyama decided to collapse his faction a week ago yesterday.
That is correct, yes. So what we have now, completely unchanged, is Aso-san, and the Motegi faction still exists on paper, but it has developed internal problems which have nothing to do with the kickback issue. So the gamble which Mr. Kishida took to make Aso-san dissolve his faction has failed. Gamble number 1, result, failure.
They didn't kind of follow his lead. He decided to be upfront, hopefully with his popularity and the appreciation that the Japanese public generally feels towards his cabinet in the low 20s, trying to establish a kind of a pattern. I'm going to be expressing leadership. I'm going to do it first. I know the Abe faction is going to dissolve. The Nikai faction is going to dissolve. And my compatriots, Mr. Motegi and Mr. Aso, they'll probably follow my lead too. And I've achieved the dissolution of factions within the LDP, and we're into a new age now. That was the gamble.
Well, it didn't work out so well as far as Mr. Aso is concerned.
No. And the whole leadership of the cabinet has been based on Mr. Aso, Mr. Motegi, and Mr. Kishida. Normally, you would think somebody from the Abe faction, which had until recently 100 members, it was the largest faction, had a representative at the table, but they couldn't have that. So there was just these 3. And among these 3, Mr. Aso played something of a pivotal role, but now it appears that his star has really risen because Mr. Motegi is suffering, as you said, and Mr. Kishida no longer has a faction and probably has a lot of people in the LDP who despise him for doing that.
That is correct. So that is gamble number 1, and gamble number 1 has failed.
So that brings us to the question, so where are we now and where are we going? Where we are right now, we've been in the parliament. The parliament will meet for 150 days. The public prosecutors cannot touch the diet members, but we've got other things going on. We've got a 150-day diet session going on now. We've got the budget that needs to be passed before April 1st. There's a lot of discussion now. Let's try and hurry up and pass the budget so that we can focus on other things. We've got the Noto Peninsula earthquake damage that we need to deal with. But the LDP convention is coming up very soon. And then the budget needs to be passed before April 1st. And then the prime minister is flying to Washington, D.C. for his state visit on April 10th. This is the first time for a Japanese leader to have a state visit since Mr. Abe had a state visit with Barack Obama a long time ago. And so this is a seminal event for the prime minister. Following that, there's a by-election. There are 3 members who have passed on. Their seats are vacant now. One because of death, the previous Speaker of the House, and 2 members who have resigned because of political scandals. One of them specifically because of this kickback scandal. He received a lot more money than everybody else, and he was sequestering away documents, and he was arrested, and his Diet staff were arrested. So it's a big deal there. Other people who are in the Diet, particularly in the Abe faction, who have been implicated, have not been indicted as yet. So the Diet is going into some kind of gymnastics now. What do we do? How do we cleanse ourselves? We need to, take the people who are mostly guilty. So that's the Abe faction and members of the Abe faction who were doing this, but also in the Nikkei faction. And Mr. Kishida, he's got to fess up too. He's got to say, I participated in that. And so the Diet, the opposition party now, is really hammering the administration for the last 2 days. Tell us who did what. Tell us how much they got. Probably you need to, or we need to, as a group, figure out what the punishment is going to be. Is it going to be censure? Is it going to be ejection from the party? They can keep their Diet badge. But that's going on right now. Very quickly, April 10th shows up. The Prime Minister is going to Washington, D.C. This is a big deal. On the 28th of that month is the by-election for these 3 members. The slide puts it up right there, Mr. Hosokawa Kakizawa, who just 2 days ago resigned his badge. This is a big deal, so they need to be replaced. Members of the Diet who die or who give up their badge and they move on, those by-elections are held twice a year, and the first time for this to happen is on April 28th. And this is presenting another challenge or a possibility for Mr. Kishida to throw down the gauntlet and gamble once again. Dan, how is he going to treat the visit of the state visit to Washington, D.C., kissed up very nicely to this by-election on the 28th, maybe 18 days later?
Well, this could possibly be the second gamble for Mr. Kishida. What is fixed is the 28th. You can't change it. It is going to happen. Another thing which is fixed is the 10th of April, the meeting between the 2 heads of states. When Kishida-san comes back here, the media will be full of pictures with him, with President Biden. This might be a golden opportunity for Mr. Kishida to say, there is going to be anyway by-elections on the 28th. Why do I not dissolve the House and call for a general election on the 28th? And the timing would be fine. The campaign for the general election would become on the 16th, the same day as the campaign for the by-elections. And based on his record with President Biden, with pictures all over the newspapers, with his rating going up slightly as a result, let's face the electorate. I am not saying there will be a general election on the 28th. I'm saying that the confluence of the visit to President Biden and by-elections that have to be held anyway would present a great opportunity as well as a great gamble. Tim?
We have been talking about the possibility or the potential of a snap election for the last 8 months. There were a couple of opportunities that came up where it was a possibility. There was some wind coming up into fill the Prime Minister's sails. And the gamble here is, if you have a snap election, a general election, the LDP ends up with more people than when it began the election. And these opportunities have not quite come up. And I think this gust of wind that everybody is waiting for, especially in the Conte, is hopefully when these 2 leaders of these superpowers get together, they hug each other, they throw a baseball. I don't know what they're going to do, but this chemistry that the Japan-US relationship is strong, it is firm, it is moving forward, and it's because of the leadership of Mr. Kishida. To have that puff of wind come in and call for an election, it does make a certain degree of sense, because what other opportunity is there until his term of office ends in September? Not very far away. Is there going to be another opportunity? Is his appreciation for his cabinet or for his performance going to continue to decline? And given what's happened over the last 3 weeks, I mean, it is just, Dan, this is just astounding. you and I have been following Japanese politics for 30 or 40 years. There hasn't been an incident like this so shaking to overall Japanese politics, but in particular within the LDP. You can't consider the LDP without the faction system kind of guiding who's going to become minister of state, who's going to have the vice minister portfolio. It's basically decided by the weight of each of the factions. But without the factions being there, and I think right now there are two factions that are left standing. The rest of them are policy study groups. Do they have the same push? Do they have the same punch to be able to achieve, even without the ability to collect funds? Can they succeed? Can they survive like that? And that's a big gamble for the prime minister to decide, having been with the president of the United States and come back. If he spends 3 days in Washington D.C., he needs to be there on the 10th. That's the state visit, probably the state dinner, maybe a speech to Congress. I can't imagine it being a 2-day trip, but maybe a 3-day trip. He comes back. He's got 2 days before he decides to close down the House, because the by-election is you have to call the general election and give people the 12 or 14 days time for election campaigning. He only has 2 or 3 days left.
That's correct. I mean, the deadline for calling a general election is on the 16th of April. So if he dissolves the House before that, then fine, general election. Gamble. And if he doesn't, then we'll see what happens later. Tim?
Dan, what is the general temperature of the diet today with regard to what the prime minister has done? I mean, his approval rating just recently produced last week put him in the low 20s, 23% approval rating. It is the lowest that the LDP has had since 2012. It's pretty low to call an election or to be prime minister in that environment, especially the dynamic and dramatic moves that he's made to dissolve these factions. What are the implications here?
It has to do with visiting President Biden, and with all the newspapers' pictures on the front page. And that is an opportunity that he is not likely to find before the end of his mandate. So the gamble is, does he do it now or no? And in my opinion, the timing would be good.
Mm-hmm.
And a decided election on the 28th. Tim?
Yes. The thing that strikes me is that through all of this turmoil, the strange thing is that in this sea of rapid change, Mr. Aso, his personality and him as the faction leader, comes out as a really strong pillar of confidence and stability, because everything else is just shaking around him. His star has risen incredibly over the last 2 weeks.
Well, I completely agree. And also the rift now that exists between Aso-san and Kishida-san, they've been working together for 2 years, and it has been broken because of a gamble that Kishida-san took of dissolving his faction without announcing it to Abe-san first. So Aso-san's star, as you said, he was already high, but has even risen as a result of that. And Aso-san will be a key player in deciding who will be the next president of the LDP.
Right. We've got a couple of months before that happens. There are opportunities, there are chances. There could be a no confidence motion filed by a majority of the members of the lower house that they don't have confidence in the prime minister anymore. And that would call for a general election too. The prime minister also, within his own power, has the power to close down the House at any time, but he's been waiting for that time. It hasn't come up. Who knows if it'll ever come up after April 10th or 11th, but he's got to make a call. And so I think the message we want to send to the viewers here today, Dan, is keep your eye on the state visit and what the prime minister does within days of that state visit, the meeting with the president of the United States that day, or maybe a couple of days afterwards. That's a very pregnant period of time for the prime minister to really stake his claim and to cast the dice and to take that gamble one more time.
The last day to take the gamble is the 15th of April. On the 15th of April, it is last opportunities to dissolve the House and trigger an election on April 28th. Tim?
Thank you very much. So that's it in a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen. We really appreciate you signing on and observing this kind of back and forth between Dan and I about what's going on in Japanese politics, what it means for the short term, and what it potentially means in the long term. If you enjoy this sort of thing, if this is a part of your business, if you need to be up to speed on what's going on in Japanese politics, please join Dan on a monthly briefing that he has. He has his briefing next Thursday. You can contact him. The details are on the sheet after we close up this room. You just need to register with Dan and get registered for the breakfast. It's a breakfast briefing starting around 7:30, goes for 1 hour. You have this update on what's going on inside Japanese politics. Alternatively, you can join me on Sunday mornings, 8:20 every Sunday on LinkedIn, on YouTube, on Clubhouse. We have a briefing, lasts for about 35, 40 minutes on what's going on in Japanese politics for that week. So Dan is giving you a monthly update on what's going on, particularly within the LDP. I come in every week with a brief description of what's happened over the last week's time. Those two opportunities really give you a lot of information on what's happening and what to keep your eye out for. Thank you very much for joining. Dan, thank you for joining me today in briefing everybody about this gamble, these two gambles that are confronting the Prime Minister. And I welcome everybody to join us for Dan Harada's briefing next Thursday, and always every Sunday, join us for the political briefing of what's happened in the last week. Thank you very much. Dan?
Thank you very much. I enjoyed every minute of it.
Thank you.
See
Stay
you.
tuned.